where do we begin? Where can we start to understand how we can use these new technologies successfully? Well, today I'm going to begin right at the end, at the deploy stage, because I think that's where some people look at Kubernetes and get rightly excited about some of the features and functions about deployments you might have heard of really have the most obvious effect on businesses. So let's start at the deploy stage and see what Kubernetes can do to improve the deployment of applications. Obviously, if I go back to a customer, the deployment happens right at the end. But there's something about this. There's the deploying of the application, and then there's all the organization that goes around the deployment of the application. So this customer had very secure applications, and they demanded a very high quality of user experience. They didn't want any downtime because of the deployment. Because of this, over the years, they've developed quite a rigorous change control process, which involved coordinating various changes within the business and ensuring that there was no other changes going on when a new application was being released. Also, because of their requirements, they would always make changes in the evenings and weekends because they didn't want a deployment to disrupt any lines of businesses during their key hours, which was during the week. That's fairly standard. Now, they also had to coordinate in this with things like patching and other application updates. The end result was all this organization took a lot of time, normally about 3 weeks to a month to kind of get the right sort of time. It also disrupted the people doing the deployments. Because these deployments were evenings and weekends, they would lose their evenings and weekends, and you'd have to have sort of people kind of working the next day, kind of in lieu, like coming at 10 and 11. Now, this sort of thing has an impact, not just on businesses, but on people's lives. I was an engineer that used to do these deployments, and although I always was happy to do these deployments out of hours, personally, it had quite a big impact. It was always difficult to coordinate, the work-life balance. So for me, this is like a really great benefit of the new way of working. If we could reduce the amount of time and the coordination effort for these releases and make these releases just non-events, then I think we'd all be happy. So let's have a look at what it takes to deploy an application on Kubernetes. I have my new idea. It's called My Fancy App. It's going to be really fancy, and my customers are going to love it. Now, in a traditional deployment, I would have to coordinate quite a few things to physically get that application visible to my customers. Typically, there would be in myfancyapp.com website. I'm joking a little bit here, but you get the picture, I'm sure. And I would then need to route my applications to the resources that would actually run the application, and then kind of wire up the URL to potentially a load balancer to go to the various VMs, open up all the connectivity. So quite an involved and complicated process. Now with Kubernetes, this becomes easy. What I can do is just pass in a YAML, which describes my application. And in this case, deployment.yaml, cleverly named. And what Kubernetes will do will then initiate my application on resources that it's got. I don't need to care where these resources are. Just I know that I need X instances of my app to run, and Kubernetes will just put them onto those resources. I don't care how. I shouldn't have to care how. But also this deployment YAML provides a load balancer service, which means that automatically the networking for My Fancy App gets set up. And the load balancer service will then straight away start to load balance between my fancy app instances, and my URL becomes live. Ta-da! Without Kubernetes, this would be a lot of manual steps. Installing things onto VMs in a secure way, making sure that you wire up the ports for the VMs correctly, and then distributing them onto some sort of load balancing service. And it would require multiple teams with different skill sets. So you would have to schedule in all of those team members to make sure they're around. But that's not all. One of the other benefits of the deployment.yaml is once my application is up, Kubernetes will be then looking at that application and checking that everything's working as expected. So if, for example, my VM falls over, one of my VMs falls over or is unavailable for whatever reason, Kubernetes will see that and go, Steve asked for 3 VMs, sorry. There's only 3 instances of his app. There's only 2 at the moment. I'm going to start up a new one. So I don't have to worry about any failures on my application. We'll get back to that. But for now, let's just say Kubernetes is keeping my application alive. A VM failure or outage can happen in multiple ways, but one of the more typical ways could actually be patching. So I want to be able to patch my operating system or my Kubernetes layer. Typically, if I was to do that, that'd take a lot of coordination. But because we know that Kubernetes will keep these VMs alive, I can now patch my operating system, take VMs out to patch my operating systems in Kubernetes runtimes, and Kubernetes will keep things alive while that gets done. It's really these small things which sort of add up to a much greater experience. Because I'm doing zero downtime patching for my operating system VMs, suddenly there's a lot less stress to organize the deployments, because patching becomes almost non-events. Now, with TKG and Tanzu, we actually package Kubernetes together with an operating system and commit to keeping those operating systems up to date. You can then also upgrade your Kubernetes estate with zero downtime. So suddenly you don't have to think about how I keep my operating system patched and secure. And that doesn't have to interfere with things like application updates. But there's more that even more than this that the deployment techniques of Kubernetes can bring. So far, we talked about operating systems and Kubernetes upgrades. But let's think about upgrading my application. So I mentioned sort of like, if there's an application failure, if it falls over, Kubernetes will keep it alive. But we don't want, things falling over and coming up. Like maybe there's a patch, an update that I need to do to fix some sort of bug in my application code. Or perhaps there's a security update in my application that I want to pass through to my customers. Or most importantly, maybe I've done some improvements on my application. I've improved my fancy app to be an even fancier app. But with Kubernetes, what I can do is I can give Kubernetes a new deployment, my deployment version 2.yaml. And what Kubernetes will do is it will look at that deployment and do a rolling update of my fancy app. So my fancy app version 2 comes up, then one of the resources for my fancy app goes down, a new version comes up, outcome goes down, and suddenly I've got my version 2 fancy app with a zero downtime, no disruption to the customer experience, which is key. Also, Kubernetes is handling the load balancing, so no networking team was involved in this upgrade. That's pretty powerful stuff, I'd say. However, we can do even better than this. what we can also do is do a blue-green deployment. If I go back to my fancy app, perhaps I want to check something before I do a full deployment of my version 2 application. Perhaps I'm like, I'd love to be able to test this new feature or functionality. But what I can do is do a new YAML file, and Kubernetes supports being able to just put in a certain percentage, and it will run my version 2 side by side on my fancy app. So I can get to learn with this new update is actually providing a better experience to my customers before I go to a full deployment. And that sort of reduces a lot of nervousness that customers have with deploying applications, because they sometimes aren't as confident as they should be with deploying apps to production. However, this confidence is something that I think is worth calling out. When we talk about blue-green deployments, quite often customers go, this is awesome. I'm going to be able to try out my application deployment, and if it's falling over all the time, we can quickly back out. Risk-free deployments. What's not to love there? You can use Kubernetes for that. But at Tanzu, we'd argue you probably shouldn't use Kubernetes for that. What would be really transformative would be to increase your confidence in your deployments. So you know your application is going to work well in production before it even gets to production. If you increase your confidence, then these blue-green deployments where you test one version against the other aren't because you're not sure that the new version is going to crash a system or whatnot. Because you want to test something really interesting, which is my new user interface or my new user functionality better? Now, that means that it's a different mindset that comes into the business, because you're then in an experimental mindset, not a defensive mindset. You get to have the confidence to experiment with new features and kind of choose the features which give your customers the best experience. So how do we improve confidence? Well, Kubernetes helps here too. Kubernetes helps here because it provides a standard way to deploy things from development, pre-production and production. Quite often when we talk to our customers, we find that there's great disparities between their different environments. And Kubernetes is declarative by nature. So what we can do is provide a standard way between each of these environments to deploy your application. And with these standards, you get an inbuilt confidence level. Now, to help with all these standards, typically customers will, but always really, I'd say not typically, when moving to Kubernetes, customers will also include some sort of version control system, a Git type repository. And their application deployments, applications will all go through this version control system. And that will be responsible through some sort of CI/CD, which we will talk about later, to get their applications through to production in a standardized way. Now, these version control systems have like a hidden benefit behind them. Each time I make a change on the version control system, the change in the code is registered and there's a timestamp. So suddenly I've got a history log of changes that are going on, which is an ideal thing to help with that coordination of change control. Because I know in my those change control reviews that I've got a complete log of what's happened and what's happened at any one time. And quite often when we talk to people about what the purposes of the change control processes is to have exactly that, a log of what's happened within my entire estate. Kubernetes kind of gives you that almost for free. It's quite astonishing. I'd like to finish this with a personal story about how standards really are important, just to show you how little things can make big differences within a business. So I think I mentioned before, I used to deploy applications as part of a previous role, and I actually worked for a large telecoms provider. Now, telecom providers, they're really heavily involved in providing high availability systems. Typical telcos will require 99.999% uptime. They call that the 5 nines SLA. And the systems I used to work with had that SLA attached to them. Now, this is back in the dark old ages where you couldn't remote desktop into systems. So I had to drive to site to get these systems upgraded. And as I mentioned before, these upgrades were actually done normally during the weekends or late in the evening. I think my change control was about 11 o'clock. So I went to one of these systems and I did an upgrade and everything looked good. We were making quite a few test calls. Everything was fine. So I was nice and happy. It was about 1 o'clock by the time in the morning, that is, by the time I'd finished everything. So I was nice and happy. I drove back home and was, 2 o'clock in the morning. This is a good night, believe it or not. Just as I was kind of getting into bed, I got the deadly phone call to say, we've got problems here. That upgrade is causing issues. We're going to need to do a backup. So, 2 o'clock in the morning, get back in, get changed, obviously, from the PJs, back to the data center. I then have to do a full rechange and it took about an hour. We get the system back up and running. It's now 3 o'clock in the morning. I've lost lost any chance of getting sleep by the time I get back home. Bit grumpy, but we resolved the issue. Now, the reason why there was an outage was actually one of the logging systems that was being used had a minor memory leak. And what happened is there was an inconsistency between the development and in the development environment and the pre-prod and production in terms of sizing. So this memory leak was never seen in the pre-production, and the fix was only ever put in the deployment. Really small component, like it was a tiny little script of some sort, but it was enough to start off a memory leak, which then expanded out and then started to hit other systems. And because it was a memory leak, it didn't happen automatically, hence it took my drive home to actually hit that problem. And I mention this because, number one, it caused a customer outage, which shouldn't ever really happen, particularly not in a telephony environment. Telephones, as simple as they are and underappreciated they are, but they're used to save lives. 999, 911. It's important stuff. But it also, as an engineer, it disrupted me for days. I'm not good after I don't have a night's sleep. So I was groggy for a few days, and obviously I was heavily involved, heavily impacted by this. But it was also the team was impacted. It wasn't just me doing this change control. There was an entire team of 5-6 people supporting me. It's like coordination engineers and stuff. And we were all disrupted. So getting a standardized environment where you can confidently do deployments and make them non-events, back then, that would seem like a miracle. So standards are important. And so far, we've talked about standards in terms of the Kubernetes infrastructure and a little bit onto the applications about how everything is tracked through a version control system. However, that's part of the picture. A modern application needs a lot of things. So if I think about my application, typically that will involve code, framework, and build to it. That will get packaged together into some sort of build that will run into my application. But my application will also have a whole bunch of other things associated with it. So there'll be networking, firewalls, there'll be databases, some logging and monitoring, and probably my application won't work in a silo. And if it is working in a silo, as a Tanzu, we would probably look at that as a bit of a bad smell. And we'd probably want to talk to you about using modern application development techniques like microservices to ensure that it would work, your applications will work nicely with Kubernetes. So we have other applications and that we also need to connect to. So all of these things need to be kept in control. And if we remember, we don't just need everything to be kept in control in production. While that is important, we also need to do it for development, pre-production, before we get into production. So there's a lot of moving parts. And as I alluded to before, a code repository with a decent CI/CD process is essential for this. Because the idea here is that we are sure on this process through, and we can make sure, be confident that our application will work successfully across development, pre-production, and production. This is the start of a transformation, where the end of the transformation is that my ideas are through on a successful pipeline through development, pre-production, and production. So I can get my idea to customers through some sort of CI/CD pipeline. And most importantly, then get information back from my users to get more ideas. And I can push those ideas through again and iterate and iterate. That's when transformation really comes in. So we've started to tackle some of the transformation for our customers. And if we look at this customer, we found that optimizing their deployment could actually reduce about 2 months of their total idea to production lifecycle. So deployments have become less of a thing, less of an issue that we need to worry about. Can we improve the rest of this pipeline? Next up, compliance check, security. Typically, these security steps happened right at the end of the project after development because things had changed, new frameworks had come into place, build processes were being fixed, and security would kind of come in at the end. But they'd also have some things up in the requirement stage, up on the left-hand side. Now, when we talk to the security teams for this particular environment and typically for other environments, it was often surprising what was being checked. First of all, the security would be focusing on things like patching and whether the latest versions were being used, which you do definitely need to be sure that you're working in the latest patches. Some of the biggest security vulnerabilities and issues of our day, like the Equifaxes, they were all due to unpatched software. So patching is definitely important. But also, it's the first step of a highly secure system. One thing we noticed is that so much effort was done on checking the security from like a versioning sort of level, CVE sort of level, that some of the wider pictures of security were being lost. Security always said, we're always on the back foot. We've already always got too many projects going on to kind of coordinate. So they were never comfortable about the type of security that they were doing, checks they were doing. They wanted to do more. So we looked at this and we thought, well, we can help here. Because one thing that Tanzu and Kubernetes generally will bring is with that zero downtime deployment, updates become regular, as we mentioned. And our updates will normally happen as part of the customer's CI/CD pipeline. So when a new update happens, it will be applied consistently, not just in the production, but pre-production and development. So any effects of the OS and Kubernetes update is seen across the board, and there's very few kind of mismatched versions between development and production. I mean, typically we've often also found that development is sort of either patched all the time because they can afford downtime, or not at all. So there's kind of differences between these environments. And we believe that you should have a regular OS and K8s update as part of your pipeline. Only part of the picture, because you also need to understand that applications have their own updates. So my fancy application will also involve middleware, like potentially kind of Apache web servers. And also my application will need updates. So how do I kind of make sure that those get updated? Well, the first thing I can do is check that these applications are patched. And for this, Tanzu are big fans of the Harbor repository. This is a container repository where I get my application containers and I put them in this Harbor before they can get sent into my development, pre-production and production sites. And the strength of Kubernetes is I can set policies which ensures that my applications can only ever come from this Harbor repository. So I can say I'm only going to allow applications from trusted places to run on these environments. From an operations point of view, that puts a big burden off of them. I'm no longer worried about applications sneaking in there, which I'm not sure or aware of. But that also pushes the can down the road a little bit, because one thing saying as operations, we demand the latest, we demand a high security application before we allow this onto our systems. However, it does mean then, well, we need to get these secure applications. And how do we get that secure application? Well, at Tanzu, we believe that customers are most successful if they have some sort of build pipeline which is automated and secure by default. And that's where Tanzu TBS comes in, built on open source technologies. We provide a mechanism to automatically update your applications and the containers that are built based on version control system changes. So as a developer, every time I do my git push to update my code in my source control repository, a new container is created with that update. Not only that, if any of the underlying infrastructure, middleware is updated, then I also have that pipeline is also triggered. So any of my Apache servers need updating, I get a new container. That way, you've got applications that can get past this crucial security gate. However, as I mentioned before, applications don't exist in silos. So what do I do about my message queues, my databases, and all the other bits and pieces that keeps my applications alive? That's where, again, Tanzu thinks that what operations needs to do is provide some sort of catalog that developers can choose from to say, I need a message queue. So here is a web message queue. I need a database. Here is a database. And by having a curated catalog, you provide some guardrails for developers and prevent them from sort of building their applications with a new fancy technology that perhaps operations we're not so sure on. We're not sure we can keep this middleware going or database going. You can provide the stuff that developers need to do their jobs, but with guardrails. So we believe an applications catalog is essential at this point. And for that, we provide Tanzu Application Catalog, which gives the developers all the tools they need to be effective in the modern development world, but with those guardrails and added security that will allow them to get through this gate of security of Harbor and remain effective. So we've got this policy in place. Everything goes through Harbor. Developers can't just grab anything from the internet and put it in any of these environments. We've put policies in place to prevent that. What we can do, though, is allow Harbor to be a proxy through to things like GitHub to allow the flexibility to ensure that developers can use the bits that they need. They can go a little off those guardrails because there's always going to be developers that are kind of always wanting to be on the bleeding edge, but still ensure the security across the board. So the key thing here is security and convenience together. However, it's not the only thing we can do with Kubernetes policies. Operations teams can also ensure that applications run in a secure way. So they can set things up to say applications can kind of work in a single sort of bundle. Bit advanced for our for this thing, but it can be done. Also, we can set policies to say applications can never run, for example, as root. So an application shouldn't ever need to run as root. It should never need to know like the nitty-gritty of the operating system. If an application is running as root, then there's probably something going on here. So we can strengthen our security policy there. We can also strengthen our network policy within Kubernetes. There's a concept called network policies. And what this will do is it will provide policies that I, as operations, can set for each of my clusters. Now, what we find before Kubernetes is customers will typically have applications across their pre-production development and production stages. And what will happen is there's 0 firewalls on the pre-production, in the development, one or two small firewalls in the pre-production to kind of loosely represent production. And then you've got all the firewalls in the world with production. And this causes problems because that deployment becomes stifled because you're waiting for ports to be opened and there's, again, no standards between these environments. With Kubernetes networks policies, then things change. What you can do with Kubernetes network policies is each application has a inbuilt with the version control specs that we put in, can be set up to kind of have its own little firewall. You can put rules in to say, no, this application will never be able to hit the outside world like the internet, or it will only be able to hit these sort of subnet ranges or these other types of applications. And you can again set this in the version control system. That's pretty cool. So suddenly it's a declarative approach to security. You're not having to kind of work around different teams to get that security you require. And it's happening on a much more granular level on the application container itself. You're not building a wall around your estate anymore. You've got lots of mini walls within your Kubernetes infrastructure. But that's not it. That's not just it. What you can also do, I've put it here for the production sites, but it can be done across the pre-production. You can take advantage of more modern Kubernetes constructs. Service meshes provide not just a firewall, but a router within your application estate in essence, which will pass traffic over to different applications over a secure link. And what this means is suddenly applications are no longer stifled by IP addresses and ports. Networking happens on a much higher level, which maps to application levels. So you just in essence say, I need this application to work with this application. Don't care where it is. That connection's already put in place. Just connect securely. The service mesh is cool because, well, it's cool for lots of reasons, but one of the big things it's cool about is if you've got multiple clusters, you can then connect them all together and see the applications running across these clusters. It'll also do fancy things like look at that service and increase application resources based on that service. So suddenly your networking gets transformed from something that you've got to manage lots of little firewalls and connectivity issues to sort of saying, right, let's look at this at a higher level. Let's abstract away that and look at networking as something that just facilitates applications and is secure by default. Okay, so we've got a lot of policies, we've got regular updates, our network's been fixed. So maybe at this stage, that compliance check can be significantly reduced. And our most confident customers will actually stop that compliance check, because what they will do is say, by virtue of my application running on this Kubernetes estate, I know that application is secure. So the compliance checks get sorted. This frees up the security team to do much more exciting things. Once we find what we find with customers is once they've stopped worrying about updates and patching and all that side of things and how applications are being run, something much more interesting gets investigated. And that's the security of things like, what happens if a developer is in my company and tries to put some malicious code into the application code itself? How do I know that a form that I've put in my application can't be manipulated in some way to expose information that shouldn't be exposed to customers? Really interesting stuff. And now security, because they've got space to breathe finally, can do that. This is where we get security really excited, having a platform which is secure by default. So we've got our deployments fixed. We've got our compliance check reduced or maybe even eliminated. We fundamentally changed the way we deploy our applications into production. Isn't it time now that we think about fundamentally changing the way that we build our software? So if you remember back, I said transformation happens when you can deploy software to customers as quickly as possible and then iterate and learn from those customers. We have customers that will deploy MVPs in a matter of weeks and then update those applications every week, multiple times a week, sometimes daily. And they do that with tens of thousands of applications. What we found where customers are most successful is that they use this methodology to reduce the risk of projects. So they can use this quick deployment cycle that we were talking about. But most importantly, they use this deployment cycle to learn. So they will build a minimum set of ideas so they can measure those ideas, so they can learn from those ideas, to iterate on those ideas to get the best possible customer experience and turn great customer experiences to absolutely delightful customer experiences. Now, I'd like to share a little quick story, if I may, on one of the most inspirational things that I've heard what our customers do with this new technology of deploying quick and learning. So our labs teams, when we work with customers to kind of produce this sort of thing with their new Kubernetes estate, what we do is we pair up with the teams, and there's a product manager, some development team, and a product designer. And we will pair with them to kind of produce a minimal viable product and then teach them how to iterate and measure and learn. It's Part of this preparing process, the designers will kind of teach things like user-centered design and doing interviews and high fidelity design documentation for the product teams to do. Now, this customer I'm thinking of, they are still a large aviation company, and we were asked to help them design a new application for their baggage handlers. So there was lots of designs came about to identify what features were the most important features for these people. Interviews happened, designs and whatnot. Minimum viable product was released to kind of that great excitement, and we were keen to see how it was handled. We deployed to these people, and they started using it. And unfortunately, the reviews were not as great as we would hope for, I'd say. And I was like, oh, yeah, we don't really like this. Bit disappointed, a little bit deflated. So we did the right thing here. We kind of said, right, let's see what's happening. So we, the Tanzu team went to the customers and saw the baggage handlers in real life using the application. And what was happening is they were using this application, where's the next bag going from? They then did this. They had huge gloves on their hands to handle these bags, and they had to tear off these gloves to use the device to press the buttons to get to the next bit of information. So every time they used this device, gloves came off, gloves came back on. Right, faff. So our product designers had like a moment. They updated their designs to work so the device would work through the gloves. Now, I would argue you would never learn that with all the user interviews in the world. That's the sort of thing that you don't get until users actually are using your products. And that's what we mean about reducing risk. It's about learning real stuff, not hypothetical stuff, but real user experience. Because time and time again, that user experience is crucial. Anyway, the update happened. The users were over the moon. It was so nice to hear these people just be delighted with the application. And also they were delighted because they were then confident that this company would listen to their requirements and be confident that those requirements would be fed back to the business and acted upon. I hope that illustrates the importance of lean product management practices. And I sort of alluded about how this product management practices come into place during that story. As I mentioned before, when we do an engagement with a customer, we bring in a team of experts that have done these sort of projects many times before to pair up with customers to mold their teams to work better together. What this typically will mean is breaking down some silos within the team. So what we find is most successful is something we call a balanced team. This is where requirements are fed into from a product manager. Typically, it might be customers have project managers, and we try to use those skills and reshape them slightly so they have a more product sort of focus. We then insist on designers to be involved in all of the projects so they can provide high fidelity designs and requirements to development. And our development are also paired up with our developers and taught extreme programming techniques. So these things are like pair programming, so working together more efficiently, and test-driven design, which I'll talk about in a little bit on there. And also getting to learn these new modern technologies and practices as rapidly as possible. The end result is that once you've got a team that's highly functional, that doesn't have to worry about the security of your platform, and deployments are zero issues, then that highly functional team can focus on one thing, and that is creating applications and better user experience. So it's that perfect mix of brilliant platform that Kubernetes can bring and modern methods of bringing ideas through to production through like a highly functionalized business team, a balanced team that is really potent. However, there's something else that we can do with that balanced team. With that extra time that we've got, we might be able to tackle that final thing, which is the testing. What we can do is then pass the testing bit and feed that testing straight into requirements. And the goal here is to use the extreme programming techniques on the development side to do test-driven development. Now, it's normally here where customers often lose me. I've found that they're normally comfortable with all of this stuff and this just sounds great. But when I talk about, could we automate your testing to sort of either fully or even like 95%, time and time again, they say, nope, it's not possible. You just can't automate our stuff. Our stuff is so unique. And I would ask you give us a try, because we have successfully developed these processes to fully automate test applications in some of the largest companies in the world. These include financial institutions and military institutions with extremely high security requirements. And I think one thing that we need to consider when we're talking about automated testing, which sometimes feels like a luxury, is if we bring in all the other bits that we've been talking about in this session today, automated testing isn't a luxury. Think about these updates that we'll be doing. Regular updates with regular middleware updates and operation OS and K8s updates, all being passed through these development, pre-production and production regularly, week after week, day after day, with not just hundreds of teams, but thousands of teams. Well, you've got your CI/CD pipeline, but all those changes will require confidence, and automated changes at that sort of extent would never happen if you don't have bots to keep that checking alive and check that other function changes don't interfere with things. So you can see these modern practices no longer become optional. They're not nice to haves. We believe they're must haves. And with the standards that you have with that Kubernetes brings, that standards we've been talking about, you can get the confidence to do this automated testing. And we're kind of confident, well, we are confident that we can show you the art of the possible and give you the skills to do this, not just in single teams, but also spread them out to the entire business. So there's a lot we've talked about. There's a lot of components. There's skills that need to be changed. There's new technologies that need to be brought in to be successful, truly successful with Kubernetes. We're here to help at Tanzu. We have a wide range of technologies and tools and services which work with Kubernetes and work around Kubernetes to make you successful. Each of our customers are different. This is never all one picture fits all. And that's why Tanzu exists with so many different components. So we can choose the right components to help you on your way and mix them in with the right services from our labs teams to ensure that you can use these products and techniques as quickly as possible. So we have Kubernetes TKG, obviously, proudly open source, regularly updated, secure, stable, and able to scale to your enterprise businesses. On top of that, we have mission control, which can provide those policies across your clusters. Make sure our applications are secure by default. We also allow RBAC control from Tanzu mission control. So your development teams can access the stuff they need for a simplified environment. We provide the secure build, so your application developers don't need to worry about updating Docker files and keeping track of the build process. We also have open source middleware and services for our TAC catalog, so your developers have all the tools they need and also some of the toys that they want to play around with, like a machine learning AI. We have a wide data offering, including message queues and open source databases to make sure that your application's data needs are fulfilled. Service mesh to connect all of these things together. We also have CI/CD and Harbor repository, and the Harbor repository we talked about. And across all of this, we have an entire estate observability system, which can look at not just your Kubernetes estate, but also your legacy estate, which will probably connect into the Kubernetes estate and make you confident that when you're doing changes, that you will see these changes happening in real time and give you full observability on the changes which are happening within your new system. We also have developer frameworks, and this is where things, I reckon, become most interesting, where we can supply your developers with the tools they need, the tools they're probably already using. Spring is the most popular enterprise-grade developer framework, and at Tanzu, we're proud to iterate on that framework, giving things like API gateways, so you can connect your APIs together, having data flow, providing masses of data across your business in a secure, reliable, and standardized way, which works for both operations and developers, and many other things. And again, through all this, we have complementary services through Tanzu Labs, which can maybe help you get your path to production traceability application, that real application through to production, so you know what it takes. We can help you with that. We can help you build your balanced team with our innovations labs. We can also help you with your enablement for SRE enablement. Everybody knows about SRE now, but we also appreciate it takes skills which are slightly different to get your operations team comfortable with handling all of this. And we want to help you here. We can do the same pairing techniques to get your operations teams comfortable with CI/CD and change control and understanding what it takes to keep a modern Kubernetes platform up and running. And we can also help you with your application modernization. We can look at your application estate as it stands right now, regardless of where it's running, and give you a guide of how to get your old applications into a new environment and start getting those benefits from those regular security updates and a plan forward on what to do with all your legacy software to allow for this innovation. So there's a lot to talk about at Tanzu, and we want to talk to you about all this. But if I was to simplify it, everything to do with Tanzu is to get that idea through to your customers, that innovation into the hands of the customers as quickly as possible, because we believe that's where you will provide the most amount of benefit to your business. And we're excited to understand and find out more about the innovations and your goals to innovate and how you plan to improve your customers' lives. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Get in touch with your TAM and ask them to set up a meeting with your Tanzu representative. We love talking about this stuff, and we want to talk to you more about this stuff in detail. So please don't be shy, get in touch, and thank you so much for your time today. I hope you found it useful.